This video is the lecture for Wednesday, April 21st, done while I'm recuperating from my surgery on Tuesday. Thank you for watching this video. This is the second for this final week of actual study material in the class. Monday, we talked about the Black liberation theology and the liberation theologies in general as one outcome of the history of the Black church that we've noted so far. Today, we're talking about the civil rights movement and the current push for social justice, racial justice in the United States that have evolved and emerged just really recently, it's just during this part of the 21st century. I'm going to, next week, we will be talking about, we're going to do wrap up and review. We'll do Monday and Wednesday classes as usual, as far as I know, and then the final exam, and I'll give you a review sheet of questions you can be thinking about and preparing to answer. Don't forget that your final papers were due on Friday, this past Friday. The final exam will be on May the 3rd, and I will email you the test, and then you can email it back to me. And again, like the midterm, it'll be on your own and on your own recognizance. Last week, Dr. Brogdon did a really nice PowerPoint for his presentation. I thought, oh yes, PowerPoint. I used to love PowerPoints and did lots of them. Let me see, where do I gotta get this? Oh. And so I made this one for this today's presentation because I'm going to give you a lot of names, dates, and information that could be difficult to hang on to. I also remembered when I did this why I don't do a PowerPoint for every class, because it took me a long time, longer than it would have just preparing for the class presentation itself. So we all learn and grow as we go. Today's topic is the civil rights movement and the current demands for justice. The Black church, as it's developed down through the past 300 years, has become the central institution, the central organization of the Black communities all across America. Those churches have struggled to maintain their fidelity, their faithfulness to their understanding of the gospel and what Jesus requires them to do in God's call to their witness. And they also have an intention with their responsibilities for their neighbors. Jesus said something about that, I believe. And how is it that the church can serve, nurture, assist, and help make some changes in the very difficult situations, cultural, structural status of Black folks in most communities in America, and particularly in the cities. They've been buoyed by that, by focusing on the biblical calls for freedom. If we focus not only on personal salvation and the meaning of Jesus and Jesus' life and death and resurrection for personal transformation and salvation, but also the biblical notions of freedom or liberation, focusing primarily on the Exodus story and the story of God's response to the people of Israel in slavery, freeing them, transforming their lives, giving them a land and a rule and a way of being a community together. So that basically those two tensions have held true, and the Black church has been a key part, not an only part, but a key part of the civil rights movement. Clearly, we're dealing with real suffering: Jim Crow, violence, economic deprivation, discrimination. In the beginning of the 20th century now, and we begin to recognize that there are people who are speaking out, speaking up, holding the tension in the Black church up for notice in the whole country. W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a clear writer, spokesperson in the early part of the 20th century, wrote extensively, spoke extensively, was a great leader. He started what was called the Niagara Movement. Might want to check that up if you're curious about it. And the Crisis newspaper, which those two things brought more into focus the discontinuity between the ideals of America, of equality for all and justice for all, and the fact that there is no equality for Black folks and very little justice for Black folks. That begins the sensitization of the Black community to their needs and their rights, setting up discomfort with the way things are. Many people would say, well, that's just the way things are. We can't fiddle with it. And it's awful. We've got to do something. We've got to stand up and create some discomfort. Shortly after Du Bois' introduction of his newspaper and his movement, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was formed in 1909. Think about how that's 111 years ago, 112 years ago now. And their focus was the very issues that were concerned for the black community: lynching, legal and justice issues. They tried to stand up for and call for legislation. They were very big in the legal defense area. That movement was huge in the early and mid part of the 20th century. It has matured, maybe past its prime and its time, and we'll see other organizations have arisen to supplement the work of NAACP. But I'm going to talk some more about how that works. Today, I want to focus on 5 areas of unsung leaders, people whose names you don't necessarily reflect on or remember with regard to the civil rights movement, past and present. Everybody thinks of Martin Luther King, and everybody thinks about Ralph Abernathy and others who, people whose names have been out there and remembered. We remember Malcolm X. We remember the people who were out on the front lines and making headlines in those days, including then President Kennedy and his Attorney General, his brother, and then LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who actually got the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts passed in later times, thanks to the movement of the show of force and discomfort of the American people for the status quo. And you have your own favorite people in the civil rights movement, and I hope you'll continue to explore them and think about what they stood for, how they connected themselves to the Christian faith. And also, I hope you'll remember some of these other names: Miles Horton, Ella Baker, Thurgood Marshall, Reverend William Barber, and the Black Lives Matter founders are contemporary folks. That's the topics. Those are the topics for today. I'm starting with Miles Horton, a white man who from Western Kentucky, Western Tennessee, actually, originally, and he became involved in recognizing out of his own, what do I say, out of his own sense of his religious responsibility for the lives of people, created in the 1930s what he called the Highlander Folk School. It was in eastern Tennessee, in the mountains of eastern Tennessee, and Highlander in the sense of that area is often called the Highlands, and Highlander in the sense of the connection between the Celtic, Scots-Irish connections of a lot of the people, a lot of the white folks who settled in eastern Tennessee and as well as eastern Kentucky. The point of the Highlander Folk School was to get connected with the needs, the actual needs of people in the Appalachian Eastern Tennessee communities, which were facing great economic deprivations in the 1930s, as you can imagine, whose voices were not heard, who were thought down upon, their hillbillies, their nobodies. And he found a way of doing basically community organizing. If you know anything about community organizing, it's a way of pulling people together. And instead of telling them, this is what you all ought to do, you ask them, what are your concerns? What issues in your neighborhood or your community are causing you worry and that are you really want to have something done about? And you gather all that into a consensus of the people who are there, and then you together start talking about, and what can, not what you individually can do, but what can we as a group of people can do. The powers, the political powers and leaders of communities and neighborhoods and states, they ordinarily get things done on their own unless a concerted effort by a larger group of people band together and have a clear message to give them and put pressure on them to get something done. It's different from lobbying. This is what we now would call protest and resistance. In the 1950s, Horton, and he developed a really clear way of teaching people how to care for themselves, figure out what their communities need to do, and get it done. He shifted his concerns and the concerns of the Highlander Folk School to deal with issues of racial justice. And just as the beginning of awareness of the civil rights movement was just beginning, he started getting folks together and training them, teaching them by collective thought, not in a hierarchical, I'm going to tell you what to do, but using this community organizing approach to figuring out how can we together strategize effective, useful, and practical ways of disturbing the status quo so that society and the leaders of society can begin to make the changes that we see need to be made. This picture is particularly amazing. I'm not sure how much of that you can see, but in 1957, this is Miles Horton probably took the picture himself, so he's not in it. On the left is Martin Luther King Jr. The tall person is Pete Seeger, the folk singer. Karis Horton, Miles Horton's spouse, I think. A woman by the name of Rosa Parks, whom you have heard, another hero of the civil rights movement, and Ralph David Abernathy. The story about Rosa Parks is not a story of her all of a sudden deciding, I'm tired, I'm going to sit down in the bus. Rosa had been since the 1950s learning from people like Miles Horton and others how to think strategically as a community to try to perturb the system into changing. And boycotts, sit-ins, and active uh, illegal resistance were all methods that were taught, methods of nonviolence, methods of getting attention without actually harming anybody. She had been carefully preparing herself for that moment when she did sit down on the bus. Now, you remember also, and I sent you a copy of it's on Canvas in last week's module, I think, preparation for this week, the real Rosa Parks story. There were others who sat down in buses and got arrested sitting in the front of the bus, even though they were Black and they're not supposed to. But it was Rosa's whose action resistance got attention, and got attention because it was part of a larger strategy. Who among those people who were resisting and arrested had the public persona and the personal following and the charisma to be able to pull off getting the attention of the community that this is a real problem. And when that happened, all of the strategies of that moment in community organizing came together to create what became the actual civil rights movement, and a boycott of the buses at that point, and then they were off. But it wasn't a let's decide to do this. It was long prepared by training of people like Miles Horton and his Highlander Folk School. The next person I want to talk about is Ella Baker. She was executive director for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the group that was eventually headed by Martin Luther King Jr. But she had been preparing herself as a leader of collective decision-making and community organizing. She, as she finished up her tenure as executive director of the SCLC, about the time of the first sit-ins in Nashville and other places, she noticed college students in that period, the 50s and 60s, were just intensely interested in standing up for a change. It was a moment, it felt like a moment of possible change. So she invited a couple of thousand students from colleges all over the Eastern US, but mainly, to an event at Shaw University, her alma mater. Basically, she used a collective leadership process where they all talked and shared in small groups, and then brought that to larger groups, and created a large consensus about how shall we put pressure on the United States to change its system of racial injustice. It was Gandhian nonviolence. It was collective leadership, and you see here her quote saying, "Oppressed people, whatever their level of formal education, have the ability to understand and interpret the world around them, to see the world for what it is, and to move to transform it." It is a bottom-up way of building a movement so that everybody has a part, everybody has an investment, personal investment, everybody plays a role in deciding what we are going to do, and that we're going to do it together. And a large reason the civil rights movement made the moves it made, the successes it did, was the careful preparation, training, experience of thousands of people to be able to put this kind of pressure. She started at that conference the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, which was much maligned by white people as just a bunch of troublemakers. Yeah, it was what the civil rights and congressman says called good trouble. It was the kind of things that the power structure called trouble, and as one theologian called it, and everybody else calls it progress. So collective leadership, nonviolence, a way of building energy as a collective that began to make a difference. So the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the NAACP, SNCC, and other organizations created a network of change agents that was not just single leadership. King was the spokesperson. He was just the right person in the right time to be the public face for that. But it is people like Horton and Baker and others who really brought it together and made it actually happen. Now, this is a name you might have heard, Thurgood Marshall. He eventually became a Supreme Court justice in 1967, but that was only after a long and illustrious career as a civil rights lawyer for the NAACP. Marshall went to the Howard University at HBCU Law School, graduated, and became the head of the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund, 1940 to 1967. There's a couple of good documentaries and then a dramatic portrayal of one of his first cases in the movie titled Marshall, which I just watched that the other night. And it's just an amazing, wonderful portrayal. And I just blocked on his name. The guy who played T'Challa in Black Panther, such a marvelous actor who died last year. He played Marshall in that particular movie. It's worth your seeing to see how they work. So the NAACP started picking cases that where Black folks were accused of crimes, and given the context and the communities where they were and the lawyers that were available to them, probably not much, were likely to lose those cases and end up incarcerated or worse. The NAACP picked those cases to try to slowly build a case backlog, a history that shows that Black folks can have an equal chance at justice in America. As we know now, watching the Derek Chauvin trial in Minneapolis, it's still not a certain thing. But the work of Thurgood Marshall started that to happen. So he tried, in the period of time of his tenure there, he tried 32 cases of Black folks, and he won 29 of them. The most famous of those cases that Marshall worked on and had been working on for years and years and years. Again, the civil rights movement didn't just happen. The integration of schools in America didn't just happen as an accident. It was that long, careful legal work by people like Marshall and others to prepare the courts with predecessor cases to begin to see how things would work. Marshall led the team that brought the case of Brown versus Board of Education to the Supreme Court, that the court finally found that the separate but equal laws of the United States, saying that you don't have to have integrated schools. As long as they're separate but equal schools, we're fine. And they basically pointed out they weren't equal. The solution that was recommended was actual full integration. It took years and years and years for schools to get integrated. Louisville is a kind of sad case of an attempt by the courts to enforce Brown versus Board of Education through extensive busing. We're still experiencing that busing difficulty. They're beginning to talk about turning it down, closing it down, but there's no good alternative because the city is geographically segregated and schools are geographically located, and schools are, here's the way it works. Schools are supported through tax funds, partially through property taxes. Now, if a school is in a very low income neighborhood or a community or city, the tax base in that city is fairly low. And so the amount of money to be able to be provided to schools is going to be much lower than the places like Anchorage and Prospect in the east end of Louisville, where they're big houses and big tax base, and people are willing to spend some money on their schools. That's the separate and unequal part of the education system in America. But it was dramatic, it was historic, it still is one of the most important civil rights cases in America in the 20th century. In the middle then of the civil rights movement, Marshall was named by Lyndon Johnson as, not by Johnson, anyway, he was named as Supreme Court Justice. He spent the last period of his life as a Supreme Court Justice, which was marvelous to have the first Black Supreme Court Justice, someone who was such an admired and obviously successful jurist and a person standing for justice. And I read recently he was miserable because he was a guy who was used to being out there in the courts and making a case and standing up for people who were being mistreated. And as Supreme Court Justice, you have to sit in your chambers and study and read and listen to what is argued. You're not the arguer, you're the listener. And that's a whole different role. But it was symbolic for him to be there. He was a key figure, a hero of the civil rights movement of the 20th century, and definitely worth remembering. Again, civil rights didn't come all of a sudden because people decided to do it. It was that long, careful preparation, in this case, from 1940 to 1967, of people like Thurgood Marshall. Now I want to bring us up to contemporary times, present times. And I'm going to talk about a hero of mine at the moment. I haven't met him personally, but I've been following his career. I've read his book, which he calls The New Reconstruction. That puts us in mind of our history now. What was the Reconstruction? When was that? And how did that work out? And why didn't it work out? He's a Disciples of Christ minister from North Carolina. He followed a call to say, I need to get involved with the community, part of his, basically the social gospel notion that he learned in seminary. And he decided to run for it, became president of the North Carolina branch of the chapter of the NAACP. And they decided to start putting pressure on the government of North Carolina to start standing up for the rights of members, of citizens of the state. So that, and he has created, he started with just a coalition of a bunch of people and talk about what they wanted to do. And then they focused on one or two major issues, which became voting rights. If we can't vote, we can't really insist on getting, I'm sorry, getting our way through the legal system in our state. So voting rights was one of the things, but we created this coalition. This coalition, I first saw the list and I thought, no way, you can't go this. It was like 14 things that we are standing in for, very diverse. And it was kind of like a shopping list of everything you want. And I said, how does that work? Then I read his book, the Third Reconstruction, and he explains he created a fusion coalition. That is to say, instead of having a group of people who are working on employment, another who are working on voting, another who are against the death penalty, people who are working for sexual justice, people who are working for environment, etc. You get all those people together and they say, what can we all agree on to begin resisting and urging our government to do something about? And with that large, huge number of people in a coalition that he holds together through collective conversation and community organizing, and they begin to put pressure. They started out with having a demonstration, and then they decided to carry that on, and they did in North Carolina at the state capitol building what they called Moral Mondays. And as many folks as they could haul out of the east and west parts everywhere in North Carolina to protest at the state capitol on Monday, to sing, to march, to chant, to speak, and to put some pressure, say, here's all these people, Congress and members of the legislature, members of the administration, who want you to do something. This is not just a single Black preacher standing up for justice. This is all of us. He then turned that into what he calls the Poor People's Campaign, which was a project of Martin Luther King's. And he's picking it up and picking up the mantle of King as the prophetic, charismatic leader of a new movement to try to bring change in America that is still much needed, still unfinished, and still working. He did a march on Washington last year, which is intended to be, thousands of people down in the mall, but because of COVID, he did it completely over a whole day of digital COVID Zoom and programs and projects. It was quite moving to see all that and carefully done, very carefully carried together as a huge his coalition, his fusion coalition. So I hope you will watch for Reverend William Barber. He's an amazing, huge character. He had a terrible spinal illness that left him much hunched over and partially very rigid physically, but he's such a powerful Black preacher and speaker. I think you'll enjoy him if you can get a hold of something on William Barber. And finally, 3 women who founded the Black Lives Matter movement: Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, and Patrisse Cullors. After Trayvon Martin was murdered in 2013, walking home from the convenience store with his hoodie on, with a bag of Skittles in his hand, a person saw him and decided he didn't belong in his neighborhood and shot him. His murderer was tried. Mr. Zimmerman was tried and found not guilty because he has a right to protect his own castle. At that moment, these 3 women said, sisters, we got to do something. We've got to start something going. They are experienced organizers, activists, educators. They know how to pull a movement together. They know how to use social media. They know how to create a hashtag. The hashtag Black Lives Matter never existed before they came up with it. And it just galvanized the country in the face of following Trayvon Martin. And it really took off the next year when Michael Brown was murdered in Ferguson, and their movement, their hashtag, their leadership pulled together thousands of people to converge on Ferguson, Missouri, a little suburb of St. Louis, and capture the attention of this country for what police brutality has been doing to Black lives. It has, it's successful when it has its own resistance, when the immediate result was all lives matter. Well, we didn't say all lives didn't matter. We just said at the moment, it doesn't appear like Black lives really do matter. Well, police lives matter more than Black lives? Is that what you're saying? Is it true that this easy way of police being completely immune to any prosecution when they shoot a Black person in a traffic stop, or for, as recently happened, for having a air freshener hanging from his rear view mirror, or in George Floyd's case, happening to spend $20 that somebody thought was a fake bill. It is summary justice and execution without due process, and they caught that attention. And then since Michael Brown's murder in Ferguson, that movement has caught on, and there are hundreds of local chapters of Black Lives Matter. They are local run. The thing about Black Lives Matter, falling in place with what Ella Baker was teaching years and years ago, what Miles Horton was teaching years and years ago, this is a non-hierarchical, collective, consensus built kind of thing. The leaders are only the leaders who set meetings up and set an agenda for discussion and get everybody involved, get everybody thinking and talking and figuring together, what can we do? It is making an impact on this country simply by the knowledge and grit and preparation of these three women who have become major influencers in what's happening in America. We don't know yet how that's going to turn out. Ms. Garza is an activist. Opal Tometi was an organizer, an immigration activist. Patrisse Cullors is an artist and an educator. They knew that together they could come up with something would make a real difference in this country's life. They became 100 both influential people of America in Time magazine last year. An interesting side comment about Black Lives Matter, and we have a chapter like this in Louisville, and that is there is an adjunct white organization called Standing Up for Racial Justice, or SURJ. And each one of those agents or chapters is locally run, non-hierarchical, very collectively run, and with a very clear idea that our job is not to directly involve ourselves in decision making in what happens in the Black movement for racial justice. Our job is to assist, to help, to encourage, to take our marching orders as white folks from the Black folks who have the agency, who have the knowledge, who have the wisdom, who have everything they need to lead this country on. Our job as white folks is to help them out, to do our part, changing ourselves. The L-Surge, Louisville, standing up for racial justice is a marvelous adjunct to the local Black Lives Matter. And they've been getting a lot of people out as well. So that in Louisville, when Breonna Taylor was killed and it became known belatedly that she had been indiscriminately shot in her apartment, having been awakened by a no-knock entry into her apartment. The protest that sprung out of that, like everything else in the civil rights movement, was not just a spontaneous, oh my gosh, we've got to do something about it. It came about because people in Louisville have been planning and strategizing and preparing and getting ready for just this kind of an occasion. So they knew how to pull groups together. They knew how to use social media. They knew how to run a meeting and a protest in a way that protects the protesters, the resistors, that gets clear to the authorities what we're doing and why we're doing it, that puts the maximum amount of pressure on the change agents and the decision makers of the community to see what can happen. It's still got a long way to go. We're not there yet. Louisville has undergone a major change in leadership of the police department. This new police chief at least has been saying many of the right kind of things. We now have a police review board, citizens police review board, which has the ability to actually make a difference in how police are held accountable for their actions. It's possible that some major reforms in the way the city operates, having somebody like Ja'Cory Arthur, faculty member here at Simmons, who's now on the city council, has all of a sudden, early on in his tenure as member of city council just this year, has made some major improvements in the way the city deals with its marginal and minority communities. For example, recently, the method of dealing with homeless encampments around the city of Louisville has been to simply go in with bulldozers and tear them apart and throw everything away because they need to be cleaned up. This past week, instead, city crews have gone in and cleaned it up in collaboration with the people who live in those encampments and figuring out how to ask for what they need and help them get what they do need. People like Attica Scott, who's in the state legislature, is an accomplished activist and has been preparing herself for this role for a long time. The fact that Cory Booker was able to make a major inroad in the state politics, running against a well-financed Democratic challenger to Mitch McConnell last year, and is going to run again probably to oppose the joke that we have with the other senator, Rand Paul. The fact that he's a Black member of the Black community and is able to have the intelligence to say that he was appealing to the hood and the holler, and that's a capture the attention of folks in two opposing parts of this state, that both of them are marginal, both of them have been underserved by the state and by the country, and maybe he can pull that together along with some liberal white folks like myself to make a real difference. um, civil rights movement, the current press for judgment, didn't all just happen, boom, like that. It happened over a period of time. I would like for you to reflect, do a little writing, your weekly report, including from what we talked about on Monday. But what did you learn about the civil rights movement from our conversation today? I'll post this on the Canvas so you can look at it again if you desire to. And I'm happy to talk about it if you need to do that as well. Thank you very much for your attention. It's always good working with you, my students of history of Christianity too. Love you.